No comment about.
Hello. So this is probably, I think we started with the JV team today because I am not, I'm not a Marx scholar. You know, I always call myself like an errant Marxist or a Cabralist because I came to Marxism through like black people. So Walter Rodney, Amilcar Cabral, Harry Haywood, Claudia Jones, Louis Thompson Patterson, Esther Cooper Jackson, et cetera, right? And then, you know, Du Bois, the late Du Bois, not like Soul of the Black Woman Du Bois. But anyway, so I actually came to Marx through these people. And so I wanted to talk about, you know, 18th Brumaire today because one of my mentors, Hudiata Chajua, was talking about, you know, the 18th Brumaire, and he's like, "You've read 18th Brumaire?" And I'm like, "No." And he, you know, responded like I said, I kick puppies for a living or something. And I was like, okay, I'll read it. And then I wanted to kind of systematically read Marx's canon in like historical order. So I started with German ideology and then went on to 18th Brumaire. So, and I thought it was an incredibly sort of enlightening book. I don't know anything about French history and I'm not that interested in it, but what I was interested in was the application of historical materialism as a method and as a approach to history. And I think that that really comes out in Marx's analysis of sort of the, you know, revolution of 1848 and the aftermath. So I think that he also does interesting work with sort of class dynamic, like interclass conflict, but also intra-class conflict. So for instance, he speaks about sort of the intra-bourgeois conflict between those who were supportive of the House of Orléans and then those who were supportive of the House of Bourbon, right? So my French is really terrible. I'm just gonna do my best. And this aligned with sort of the capitalist class versus the landed class. And the conflicts therein. And so I think that we're seeing sort of this bifurcation of the capitalist class today between sort of financial capital that's very much invested in globalization and in, highly securitized forms of accumulation, and then traditional capitalists or productive capitalists who tend to be anti-globalization. And the ways in which these differences have played out through, you know, political parties and also conflicts within like the Republican Party. Right? I was also interested sort of in his discussion of peasants, French peasants, and then peasant support of Louis Bonaparte, and also their relationship with the urban proletariat. And I was interested in this not only because of, you know, his idea that basically the peasantry is backward and they need the urban proletariat to guide them toward revolution or to align with them for the purpose of overthrowing the bourgeoisie, but also thinking about that in relationship to the way that Frantz Fanon and Amilcar Cabral talk about the peasantry. So for Fanon, he says that the peasantry is essentially the most revolutionary class because they haven't been conscripted into colonial capitalism in the way that the urbanized proletariat or the urbanized workers have. And so, you know, Fanon also says that Marxism needs to be stretched when applied to the colonial question. So just thinking about how Marx's analysis is useful but cannot be directly applied to other moments and other sort of spaces. He also speaks about like the role of the lumpen proletariat, especially their support of Bonaparte and the ways in which he utilized them as part of his individual army to sort of shore up his power. And then also the way in which the suppression of the working class was undergirded by, you know, this anti-socialist rhetoric, which is very reminiscent of the Red Scares that we saw in U.S. history and still see today, right? The way to discredit somebody is to call them a socialist, even if they're like Obama, where you're like, what? So, I when I read 18th Brumaire, I'm really thinking about how it lends methodologically and also conceptually to thinking about our contemporary moment, or also changes in cycles of accumulation. So one aspect, when I was thinking about this intra-bourgeois conflict, I was thinking about sort of Hillary versus Bernie, right, and the Democratic Party and the different sort of not only ideological but kind of class interests that were playing out through that conflict. So Bernie, who's a social democrat, and then of course Marx has a particular critique of social democrats, and then Hillary, who's I don't know what she is, I guess a Wall Street stooge or whatever you want to, I don't know, sorry, she can do whatever she wants. But anyway, so there's a way in which these intra sort of bourgeois conflicts are playing out, and I think that the way that Marx discusses this with respect to the Revolution of 1848 is instructive. So I think also the 18th Brumaire provides insights into how to go about the study of history and the analysis of the contradictions and class antagonisms that drive historical development. Because in the United States, Americanism has stood in for Marxist analysis, there's often a way in which we attribute things to race or to other factors that really are best explained through class contradictions. And so I think, again, 18th Brumaire is revelatory for that. And then also thinking about the nature of bourgeois revolution, because this is obviously a critique of bourgeois revolution and its impermanence, and also it's the incomplete nature. And so if we think about sort of the anti-colonial revolutions of the 1960s and 1970s, they were very much, many were bourgeois nationalist revolutions, right? Or what's been called flag independence, which then created the conditions for neocolonialism. And so Marxist critique of sort of the giving up of political power for economic security or for social class sort of interests is also instructive for thinking about the failures or the problematics of anti-colonial struggles of the 1960s and 1970s, which is also another interest of mine. So anyway, so Marx is writing the 18th Brumaire in the context of a series of revolutions that happened between 1848 and 1850 in Europe. There's the uprising in Paris that he talks about in this text. There's also one in Vienna, one in Rome, and then the Hungarian Revolution. And these sort of represented the first examples of independent working class or mass political action in European history. And so this is a very sort of fecund time for thinking about the possibility of proletarian revolution. It also this time period gave Marx and Engels the first major opportunity to put their revolutionary theories into practice and to use the theoretical framework that had been developed in the Holy Family and the German ideology and apply it to sort of what is happening around them. And the Revolution of 1848 in France in particular gave Marx a chance to analyze and write about the development of the revolutionary movement, applying the method of historical materialism, and this is really the significance of the 18th Brumaire. So he wrote these chapters between December 1851 and spring 1852, and it was first published in May 1852 as the only edition of the non-periodical journal Die Revolution. That's German, I don't know. So it's not like Die Revolution, it probably means the revolution or something, I don't know. So in this iteration, it was published under the title of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, as opposed to of Louis Bonaparte. There were two reprints, one in 1869 and one after that, I can't remember the exact date. But the significance of the title 18th Brumaire is as follows. So during the first French Revolution of 1789, revolutionaries got rid of the Roman calendar and renamed the months of the year. 18th Brumaire corresponds to November 9th, and on November 9th, 1799, Louis Bonaparte's uncle Napoleon overthrew the French government and gave himself absolute power. As I'll discuss below, in December 1850, the nephew Bonaparte suspended the Legislative Assembly and declared himself Emperor of France. So this is the relationship This is why he uses the title 18th Brumaire. So when Marx writes in the opening lines of chapter 1, quote, Hegel remarks somewhere that all facts and personages of great importance in world history occur, as it were, twice. He forgot to add once as tragedy and once as farce, end quote. He's referring to the parallel between not only the two Bonapartes, but also between the French Revolution of 1789 and what he deems a farcical revolution of 1848. So the text offers, not only offers the method of historical materialism, as I mentioned earlier, but also elaborates the theory of class struggle, of the necessity of proletarian revolution, and of kind of the ultimate relevance of the dictatorship of the proletariat. He also shows that only the victorious proletariat can topple the bourgeoisie and its structures, that when revolution is left to the hands of the bourgeoisie, it will ultimately become reinterpolated into the system as such. And then he develops the idea that only the urban proletariat is a natural ally of the peasant, and that the two must ally against capital, but that the peasants must necessarily follow the urban proletariat, given the nature of sort of alienation and isolation that constitutes peasant existence. He also shows that the growing strength of the working class and its struggle with the bourgeoisie was a constitutive feature of French society at that time, and also distinguished it from the period of 1789 when the first revolution took place, and also accounts for many of the contradictions therein. And then he also, to me, elucidates the importance of historical knowledge, because Engels points out that Marx was he avidly studied French history. There was something about kind of the evolution of modernity and the evolution of the modern capitalist system to which France was central. And so I feel like contemporarily, we have no historical memory. We know very little about history. We think that we're doing everything for the first time, which is clearly not true. As one of my advisors used to say, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And to realize that, Oh, okay. So my advisor, swagger jacking Mark Twain, said that. But to realize that, right, or to I guess unpack those rhymes, you have to have some sort of historical memory and some sort of historical analysis. And importantly, the 18th Brumaire centers not individual actors, but rather the ways that social conditions and material foundations influence or determine political choices. So Marx writes, quote, upon the several forms of property, upon the social conditions of existence, a whole superstructure is reared in various and peculiarly shaped feelings, illusions, habits of thought, and concepts of life. The whole class produces and shapes these out of this material foundation and out of corresponding social conditions, end quote. Another interesting thing that Marx writes in the preface to the second edition of 1869 is that one of the aims of this text is to get rid of the concept of Caesarism, right, which conflates ancient and modern class struggles. So he writes, quote, in this superficial historical analogy, the main point is forgotten, namely that in ancient Rome, the class struggle took place only within a privileged minority, between the free rich and free poor, while the great productive mass of the population, the slaves, formed the purely passive pedestal for these combatants. People forget Sismondi's significant saying, the Roman proletariat lived at the expense of society, while the modern society lives at the expense of the proletariat, end quote. So I think that stuck out to me because of the ways in which, so I'm trained in Black studies, especially persons trained in my field make these ontological and transhistorical arguments about Blackness, right? Or these very lazy analogies like Black people are still slaves, and it's like, no, we're not, right? And to make these sort of spurious comparisons or analogies negates the social relations that produce and reproduce Blackness. And so I think that Marx is saying the same thing when he's saying Caesarism is distorting more than it's illuminating, right? So in terms of the text, Marx starts with a discussion of Louie Philippe, who is known as the July monarch, who came to power in 1830 through a popular uprising and installed a constitutional monarchy, but he turned out to be both anti-democratic, banning political demonstrations and restricting the vote to just 1% of the French population. In February 1848, he banned political banquets, which, because of the ban of political protests, the masses had organized these political banquets during which they could go and express criticism of the regime. Louie Philippe bans these as well in February 1848. So on February 23rd, 1848, the revolution began. So the revolution of 1848, when French soldiers fired into a crowd of protesters, killing 52. French people of all classes participated in this revolution, and they took to the streets, built barricades, and began to storm the royal palace. Louie Philippe fled and abandoned the throne. And this represented a fundamental challenge from below. So this seems promising, right? However, the plot thickens. So the French installed the French Second Republic came to power, declaring universal suffrage except to women, right? And helping to eradicate conditions of unemployment that plagued the country. They also eased the political repression that had been constitutive of Louie Philippe's reign. But the contradiction of the Republic was this, right? On the one hand, it created the conditions for competing bourgeois factions like the landowners, industrialists, and finance capitalists to work together to consolidate their class rule. On the other hand, it also forced them to contend with other classes in French society. And so this is what kind of characterized the weakness of the Revolution of 1848, that in order to quell the power of other classes, ultimately the bourgeoisie ended up abdicating its own political power. So the working class mobilized to push the Republic to the right, the working class mobilized to push the Republic, to radicalize the Republic, basically, to push for more rights, while the business class and farmers resented the taxation that was necessary to ease unemployment, which is, what always happens, right? And worried that order was not being effectively restored. So in 1848, a coalition of moderates and conservatives were elected to the assembly and began to push the government to the right. One of the great things about the 18th Brumaire is that it gives us a way to think about our own political economic shifts. So when Marx is writing about this period, it really reminded me of the shift from embedded liberalism to neoliberalism, because as we know, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the United States was in the throes of stagflation, and there was a declining rate of profits, and also mass dissent, right, or residues of the mass dissent that had rocked not only the nation but the world between the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so the pushback of sort of capital and the ruling elite against these uprisings and against the declining rate of profit was the entrenchment of law and order, the election of Ronald Reagan, and the adoption of so-called trickle-down economics, and also neoliberalization. And so we see the ways in which popular uprising is often met with forms of extreme conservatism and repression. One might argue that this is what happened with the Obama presidency, even though there was nothing radical about that presidency. I guess, as I was saying last night, when there's a black person, it's always considered to be sort of inherently or objectively sort of radical or progressive, irrespective of whether they're bombing people out of existence and deporting more people than any other president in history, or whatever else people are doing, bailing out banks. Starting on June 23rd, 1848, which are known as the June Days, the government abandoned its policies to ease unemployment and deployed the army to the most rebellious working class neighborhoods. 3 days of fighting pitted artisans and workers against the National Guard, and the latter ultimately prevailed, so they crushed the proletariat. And so this was a joint effort of all other classes against the working class. So Marx writes, quote, "All classes joined hands in the June Days in a party of order against the class of the proletariat, which was designated as the party of anarchy, of socialism, and of communism. They claimed to have saved society against the enemies of society. They gave out the old slogans of the old social order, property, family, religion, order, as the passwords for their army." So after the defeat of the working class, a constitutional assembly was convened by the remaining bourgeois liberals, who drafted a new constitution while still remaining staunchly right-wing. It gave the future executive control of the army, and the power to appoint and dismiss officials in the National Assembly. And this came to bite them in the ass once Louis Bonaparte was elected in December 1848. And Louis Bonaparte was extremely conservative, right? And the election of Bonaparte represented the continued fear of not only the fear of the empowerment of the working class, but also the willingness of the bourgeoisie to sacrifice parliamentary democracy and power for order, stability, and favorable conditions for business. So class interests supersede political power, right, and democracy. So Marx writes, quote, "The bourgeoisie confesses that its own interests dictate that it should be delivered from the danger of its own rule. That to restore tranquility in the country, its bourgeois parliament must, first of all, be given its quietus. That to preserve its social class intact, that to preserve its social class intact, its political power must be broken. That the individual bourgeoisie can continue to exploit the other classes and to enjoy undisturbed property, family, religion, and order, only on condition that their class be condemned along with the other classes to political nullity." So again, to be able to continue to accumulate profit and to rule other classes, they have to give up their political power, and they effectively elect a tyrant. Interestingly, Bonaparte's rule was not actually representative of the bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie, or the proletariat, nor was it representative of the peasants who helped to put him into power, not least because of their affinity for his uncle Napoleon. So nobody really but Bonaparte benefited from his rule. In May 1849, the Conservative Party of Order held the majority in the Legislative Assembly, though there was strong opposition from the coalition of radicals and social democrats known as the Montagne faction, Montagne, who speaks French.
Sorry, what was that?
Montagne.
Montagne.
There you go, Montagne faction. After the latter staged a peaceful demonstration in June of that year, their leaders were arrested and expelled from the assembly. So after he was elected, Bonaparte began to assert his authority over the Party of Order, which is the conservative party that was responsible for his election. And in 1849, he suspended all the ministers except those who were the most loyal to him. For its part, instead of aligning with progressive forces to wrest power from Bonaparte, in March 1850, elections were held to replace the radical leaders who had been expelled the previous June after that peaceful protest. When the Parisians voted overwhelmingly for the Montagne faction, the Party of Order abolished universal suffrage, ultimately disenfranchising 30% of the French electorate. So here we see the Party of Order's anti-radicalism used to act against their own political interests while also preserving the reign of Bonaparte, who had moved to limit their power, right? Bonaparte also used the fear of socialism to curb freedom of the press, to put the clergy in charge of education, and to assemble his own lumpen proletariat army, to which he provided loans and other benefits. Throughout the summer of 1850, he continued to consolidate his power by seizing control of the army from the assembly and appointing even more conservative ministers. In October 1850, he further undermined the authority of the assembly by stating his intentions to reinstate universal male suffrage. Now, this wasn't because he cared about democracy, but rather to undermine that mandate by the assembly to curb universal suffrage. So it was a power play, right? And so the coup de grace comes December 2nd, 1851, when Bonaparte sounded the death knell of the assembly by disbanding it and declaring himself Emperor of France. And so this is what Marx deems the farce, right? That what started as a very popular cross-class uprising against tyranny ultimately manifests in authoritarianism that was supported by the very classes who in part were involved in the 1848 uprising in the first place. So, he's really thinking about how is it that this happens, right? How does a very progressive and grassroots movement become narrowed to such an extent that the group puts into power an authoritarian who curbs their power, and they are complicit in this, and in fact, create the conditions for its possibility. So, parallels have been drawn between the election of Trump, also on November 9th, Brumaire, right, 2016, and the reign of Louis Bonaparte. Both came to power in a context of increased poverty, the repression of the left, and appeals to the dispossessed, right, or the manipulation of these feelings of sort of dispossession. Both are understood to be buffoonish tyrants, and that show little regard for the legislative branch or for the electorate. And of course, the anti-socialism of Bonaparte and the anti-socialism of the U.S. generally is an obvious parallel. Then there's the support of Bonaparte by the French peasants on the one hand, and the overwhelming support of Trump by rural working class, working classes and underclasses. And the overwhelming support of Trump by rural, working class, or underclass elements. Though these were by no means his only supporters. So that's a narrative that has been circulated, but we all know that a whole bunch of white people voted for him. So no offense. There's also the parallel that in both situations, instead of forming coalitions in solidarity against tyranny, key elements, so key capitalist and elite elements, capitulated to the promise of order, anti-socialist propaganda, and class interests. So that is sort of what I have. I get tired of hearing myself talk. So, but I will offer some sort of, I guess, discussion questions that we can engage or not engage. I don't know. All right, the first is, how can Marx's historical materialist method help us to understand our own context and to identify the contradictions? What are the contemporary alliances necessary to challenge our own farcical leader? So Marx writes, quote, at the very time when men appear engaged in revolutionizing things in themselves and bringing about what never was before, at such very epochs of revolutionary crisis do they anxiously conjure up into their service the spirit of the past, assume their names, their battle cries, their costumes to enact a new historic scene in such time-honored disguise and with such borrowed language, end quote. So why in moments of upheaval do some look backward for inspiration in ways that fundamentally distort what's possible, given their historical and material conditions? And how do we see this playing out today? And finally, how does economic or class commitments influence us to act against our own political interests or to abdicate our power? So let's talk.
Anybody want to comment or continue the conversation in some direction? Huh? Okay.
But thanks, Tom. That was really wonderful, and of course, the analogy with Trump is very good. So I have 3 points, but in order to not, as you said yesterday, do me and actually do Q&A. I'll just raise one for now. So I think that you're absolutely right that this text is very relevant to think about our own situation, the United States particularly, but across the world. I mean, buffoons like Trump are being elected as well too. So, okay. So I guess my tuppence worth would go as follows. And I think I'll preface that. Go as follows. Obviously, democracy in the context of class rule is itself contradictory. Mm-hmm. Even liberal democracy,
especially liberal democracy.
But you might want to argue that liberal democracy is precisely democracy designed to adapt to class rule. But I would say even then it contains contradictions. Further, then, I would suggest that perhaps it would be best to think of these contradictions as having a horizontal and a vertical axis. So the horizontal axis consists in the competition among different bourgeois, different elements of the propertied or ruling classes, who may or may not cohere into a coherent ruling class. And at this point in time in the United States, it certainly seems to me to be very clear that the ruling class is a little bit rudderless. It is riven with its own differences. He can't decide how to approach the rest of the world or how to respond to the challenges that the rest of the world represents. So I would say that certainly on that front. Because you see, many people say that liberal democracy is the characteristic form of bourgeois rule, but that ain't so. Historically, what's natural to bourgeois rule is to have a representative form of government in which various factions of the bourgeoisie are represented, and then you have a parlement, in French literally talking shop, in which their interests are brokered and cohered to create a kind of state policy.
So this is consociational democracy?
It's representative, but it does not include universal adult franchise. The moment you inject that element into what was supposed to be a merely representative setup in which only the property had some say, and you inject universal adult franchise, then you are opening a whole new can of worms, and that's where the vertical contradiction, the top up and down contradiction comes in. And so what you see here is an early instance of how things went pear-shaped in a situation which combined the two, right?
Did you say pear-shaped?
Pear-shaped.
Yeah,
It fell
I don't
down,
think that's
right?
a negative thing. Yeah.
And so it's one has to be very careful to distinguish between the representative element and the democratic element. And therefore, the settling of the horizontal contradictions of capitalism and then the vertical contradictions. And in that sense, I would say that, you see, because the other great thing about this text, and I think your talk did bring up many elements of this, is that Marx discusses that at this time, both contradictions on both axes were active. On the one hand, the various factions of the bourgeoisie were struggling against one another. On the other hand, there was the popular pressure as well. So that's my...
Yeah, no, I think that that's a great point, right? And I think that even what you say about responding to foreign policy concerns is actually part of the ruling elite, ruling ideology, because it wasn't always so that the United States was sort of the police of the world or sort of the regulator of freedom and democracy. That's a relatively recent development. And so I think that that's part of the intra-bourgeois class struggle in itself. It's like, do we have a responsibility to respond on the one hand? And other people are like, no, right? You have abandoned your base by constantly focusing on what's going on abroad, right? So I think that that's part of the horizontal struggle in itself. But there's also the horizontal struggle within the working class, right? Complicated by race, but not reducible to it. So it's all, so we have yet to resolve this conundrum of the working class voting against its own interests. What is that, right? And so white supremacy is the easy sort of rationale, but is there more going on there? And if it, and you see the struggle with, I guess, the Democratic Party is that the Democratic Party is sort of everybody thrown together that's not like white, conservative, or, moderate, I guess, to a certain degree, but it's literally everyone else. And it's really difficult to build coalitions in that way. It's really difficult to come to some sort of consensus. And it also is fodder for the Republican Party to use all sorts of dog whistles to mark that out, I guess. And so I think that there's also the sort of working class horizontal struggle that is really difficult to work out in a time of increasing permutations of identity, in times of such a swing to the right that anything that's not fascist is considered progressive, and that's a problem in itself, right? Because we start to have these sort of at least politics. Well, at least it's not this, right? Well, at least it's not that, and it's just negotiating the terms of our immiseration. So I'm just rambling at this point, but anyway, so I think that there's many horizontal and many sort of vertical struggles going on simultaneously, as you noted.
Like you mentioned that like the class interests sort of trumped the political power. I don't have a lot of context on this question, but I was wondering if you could, I don't know what that looks like in terms of like what is the form in terms of like the ideological, cultural forms that something like that would take. Like how was that actually reproduced? Like what would be the dominant ideas because right now there seems to be, of course, with Trump, a sort of even explicitly a very contradictory aspect that he is against the swamp or whatever, even though like he's the biggest swamp monster, I guess. And like, is it just some kind of this ideological confusion where, you know, it's really the mafia saying that we are against the mafia? Or, like, is that something that also happened at the time, or is there something that you think about it?
Well, I think that what manifests with respect to France between 1848 and 1850 is that the bourgeoisie was extremely concerned about order, right, and extremely concerned about ensuring the best conditions for business. And for them, because of this contradiction between having political power on the one hand and that meaning other classes have political power on the other hand, they were willing to capitulate that political power to Louis Bonaparte, right, who would effectively ruled as an authoritarian. So in order to be able to continue their class position and to dominate other classes, they were willing to not be able to dictate and determine policy and practice, right? So that's how it manifests in this regard. With respect to the United States currently, it's kind of like people, and somebody might have said this yesterday, you know, being anti-immigration, but then complaining about not having cheap labor to work, you know? And so it's those sorts of political, right? So the political project is anti-immigration, but then the economic project is like, we want to pay people as little as possible to be able to, right, you know, accumulate profit. And so it's those contradictions, right, between the political ideology on the one hand and then the economic imperatives.
Well, that last one is the contradiction for rich people in a Republican Party that need the cheap labor that they're bringing in, but also need the rabid right anti-immigrant people to support them to keep them in power. So they have to nod towards that, saying they agree with it, while trying to undercut it all the time by bringing cheap labor in because they can't live without it. So that's a contradiction of capitalism at the moment, though,
right?
I think.
But I think that it's also so, like, you know, there are persons who write about like states of exception. And so the other thing that Marx talks about is the way in which the state under Bonaparte becomes disembedded from society. And I think that the ruling class at this moment is trying to do just that. They want to implement a bunch of policies and legislation that apply to everybody else, but they want to be exempted from those impositions. And so they want to create the conditions by which they have their own autonomous society. Right, this is why people are trying to like go to the moon and shit, go to Mars and leave, you know, the blacks and I guess everybody else behind. You know, this is why they want, the project of the massive redistribution of wealth upwardly is so that you don't need labor. You don't need any. You can wall yourself literally off from the rest of the world and just do your own thing and let the chips fall where they may. So this is why you can disinvest from education. Your children ain't going there, right? You can disinvest from parks and public services. You're going to have your own parks, right? And so I think that seems to be one of the features of this ruling class is that they're trying to completely disembed, right, from society, which is probably a reflection of the current crisis, right? So.
Yeah.
This is. I love your last point. I think it's really right. So this is just a comment on that's a different one. One of the things that I find really exciting and interesting about the 18th Brumaire and your engagement with it as well is that it subverts people who want to be really orthodox determinist economicists, Marxists, who say, look, things are not that simple. It's not like there's going to be a easily mirrored direct path from economic domination of part of a class to the politics that unfolds. The politics is going to unfold in all sorts of ways, like bring remnants of the past, symbols from the past, complications of different groups who may very well politically not vote or make choices in their own economic interest for other reasons, just as you laid out. So that's what, just a comment, is just really thinking about how Marx can speak to political theory and politics and not only in an economically determinist way.
Right. I think that that's a good point, right? And so even as we say, the white working class is voting against their own interests. Well, what interests, right? Because interests clearly are not purely economic. So I think, again, to make those sort of blanket statements can be like an evasion of responsibility to figure out what's actually going on, and also like a conceit that we know what the interests ought to be for that group, and therefore they're acting against it. I don't know. I don't live there in Appalachia. Like, I don't know what their interests are, right? Their interests very well could be like, we hate the colors, we want to get rid of them. And for whatever that does, either gives them a psychological wage or an epidermal wage. I don't know. But, I think that it would serve us well to actually figure out what's going on than to just trade in sort of these tropological understandings of politics, right? And so I do think Marx gives us a vocabulary or offers a vocabulary to do that.
I was just going to ask, what do you think, what is it about, Napoleon and Trump's ability to deal with, seemingly progressive things that actually have regressive, impacts, advocate universal suffrage and then, have people go along with that and not have people understand that that's, actually a regressive tactic. I think it's, Cheney or, a Bush advisor was we don't listen to history, we write history, we remake it faster than other people can understand what's happening. And I don't know if that's the fact that right-wing movements are so successful that it's just because control of media or or people's just tendency to listen to power, or if it's something more about their tactics. And I wonder if the left can use that anyway.
Yeah, I think so. Again, I've evoked Gerald Horne many times, and that's just because his canon is instructive to me. But we forget that we're in a counter-revolutionary moment, right? This is not a progressive country. That's just the idea. That's just the ideology. So the left is the minority, right? The left is the group that's radically out of touch with what the actual state of things are. The problem is that we don't believe our own analysis, right? We talk about how a country is exploitative, patriarchal, sexist, ableist, homophobic, and all these things, but it's sort of this but-for logic, right? That the United States would be great but for all of these things, right? We see them as malformation as opposed to endemic in the project. So I think it's not that the right has always been victorious, but there have just been what Derek Bell, the critical race theorist Derek Bell, calls interest convergence, right? That there are particular historical moments in which the interests of the state must have aligned with those who are trying to change the status quo. So civil rights in the context of the Cold War. You can't keep lynching the blacks if you want the decolonizing world, which is racialized people, to align with you. That's interest convergence. It's not like there was a change in hearts generally where it's these blacks are equal. No, but pragmatically, it's interest convergence, right? The Civil War, right? There's a way in which Northern capitalist industry was no longer dependent upon the Southern cotton aristocracy in ways that they had been previously. So those capitalist interests aligned with abolitionist interests and the massive uprising of enslaved people, if we believe Du Bois, right, that this was a general strike. And so these periods are few and far between, but by and large, the right wins, generally. This is why the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed in the 1860s. It's 100 years for acts to be passed to enforce them, right? I don't know if I answered your question. I feel like you asked me what time it is, and I told you how to make a watch, but to go that off read, right? But yeah, so that would be my response.
I wanted to invite you to answer the second of your discussion questions.
Mm-hmm.
So the second one was something like, you quoted Marx talking about how people appropriate stuff from the past
Mm-hmm.
that may or may not apply to the present.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking the two examples that popped in my head were the use of Black Panther
Exactly.
iconography, but also like the America First rhetoric, which was first used by the Klan, which is now more or less the Make America Great Again sort of thing. So yeah, very different politics, but using the same kind of rhetoric. So what do you think? What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that's a very, the idea that we make our history in costume,
Yeah.
is one of the things in this that is just stunning.
Yeah.
These people dressed as Romans, you have to ask, what do we dress up as we conduct our politics that we don't see? And I'm thinking, that.
Yeah, so I invite everyone to respond to this question, right? Because these are not just for me to be a talking head, and this is not an answer at all, but I always crack up when I see, like, in Africa, the courts, when they're wearing these fucking powdered wigs and shit, and I'm just like, you can at least put on a powder afro. Like, why do you have this? This traditional like parliamentarian garb. It's like, why though? You look stupid. You know what I mean? And it's interesting because today is like the royal wedding, and my like Facebook timeline is lousy with like, oh my gosh, the end of race again, like Obama 2.0. And it's just it's interesting. So there was a Black preacher there, and there was also people singing like Negro spirituals or something. So it was like, oh my gosh, bringing together the two cultures. That's just an aside. That has nothing to do with what you said. But so I think that part of my frustration with contemporary activists is the aestheticization of politics and the ways in which sort of taking up the approaches of like, especially there's something about the 1960s moments that really resonates with like Black activists. And so I get it, right? Marches, right? But what does it mean to engage in that form of protest in an era of extreme surveillance and pervasive and sort of sanctioned police brutality? Is that the approach we ought to be taking? Like, there's a saying that is, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything will look like a nail. And the problem is you only have a hammer if you're always looking back to previous moments to resolve contemporary issues. So I think that it's accessible and it's sexy. And, the 1960s was like a moment where real change seemed possible. There was like global euphoria and optimism. Like people really thought the end of capitalism was coming given all of these global upheavals. So there's something, there's just something that's like exciting about that. But it's just woefully, I think, inaccurate for what it is that we're dealing with contemporarily, which is also my kind of critique of these trans-historic or ontological arguments. That's like, Black people are still slaves, or this has always been the case. And it's like, no, right? Yes, these things are reproduced under different social relations, right? And so we have to understand what those social relations are, and that needs to dictate and determine what the strategies and tactics ought to be. So I don't know what it is. I think that it's, it's nostalgia. I think that it's looking for kind of mining times where change seemed possible. But I don't know why that happens, right? Because Marx is pointing this out in 1848 and 1850. So it's clearly something that tends to happen. So I'm not certain why, but I hope others will chime in. Maybe you know the answer. I know you have something brilliant to say. Go on.
I just wanted to come back to 2 points that kept coming up again and again. One is that people vote against their interests, and I think you were right to question it. I just wanted to take it further. And the other is whether the election of Obama made any difference, progressive difference to race issues. But
sorry,
I'm going to roll your eyes, and I roll mine too. And I tell my students, how can it happen that under the watch of the first Black president of the United States, you had the emergence of a movement that said Black lives matter, not Black aspirations matter, not Black people need, but just something as basic as life. Mm-hmm. Life matters because you are killing them. This is horrible, etc. So I'm not under any illusion about this. But I remember the race. I remember listening to people being interviewed on the radio, which is how I mainly get my news. But on the radio, people said, "I will not vote for that man. He's black."
Mm-hmm.
This is how things were before Lehman Brothers collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
And between that moment, so after that, basically something happened between early September and November that managed to get a very substantial number of white voters to vote for Obama. And I think that makes a difference. And I think that the fact that you are quite right, there is, contrary to all the narratives about America does not believe in equality. America is founded on the idea of inequality, and for that country to have to elect a black president, for that country to be in a situation where this was their best option, it makes a difference. And I don't want to, so I don't want to say, all I'm saying is that there's a contradiction. I also remember saying very early on that Barack and Michelle Obama were modeling an extremely repressive form of family for black people. Where they were basically saying, the wife should be at home, look after the kids, blah, blah. I mean, how many black families can afford this? What kind of, I accept all the criticisms. All I want to say is that it does make a bit of a difference. Maybe nowhere near enough, but it did make a bit of a difference. And then, so the second, on the point of voting against your own interests, I really do think that sometimes we end up in our rhetoric, we end up building up the strength of the right when we should be measuring our own limitations, the limitations of the left. The right is stupid. The right could not do anything better than Donald Trump. It is our debility, it is the left debility that meant that we allowed Bernie Sanders not to get the, and I don't think he's the deliverer, but he would have been a definite downside better, and he could have defeated Trump in a way. So I just want to say that, people are not voting against their interests. I think you said something very important. I think when you're poor, when you're white, and you've got a shitty leadership, you might be persuaded that simply keeping black people in their places in your interests. I'm sorry, but that's the structure of society. And so I think that it is the kind of leadership we've had on the left for decades. I basically think that the left has never been able to, they talk endlessly about neoliberalism, they have never produced a left response to it. Never.
You made a number of good points, a number of points I'm like, whatever.
Okay.
All right, no, so I have no dog in the Obama fight. I might just punt that. What I will say is that if we think about this idea of once as tragedy and once as farce, right? If we think about the Obama presidency as tragedy and the Trump presidency as farce, just in terms of sort of popular mobilization, right? Because I think that both Obama and Trump use the exact same tactics in terms of mass mobilization to get into office. They both were anti-establishment because, of course, Hillary was the establishment candidate when Barack Obama was running. You remember she stayed in the primary race till they had to drag her ass out of that primary race like, you lost, right? You lost, right? Obama's our candidate, but that was the longest primary race, right? And so he was the anti-establishment candidate. He ran, he ran like a sort of mass mobilization campaign. He didn't use as blatant of race dog whistles, but it was certainly part of his campaign, not least because like Michelle Obama was that statement. He didn't have to come out and be blackity black, black, black because his wife was, right? There was something about her, and not even like a light-skinned black, like a black person, right? There was something that resonated with people, right? He got a lot of props and credit for that. Anyway, so whatever, right? I think that there's something parallel about and in the final analysis, I don't know if there's anything objectively better about black people voting for Obama because he was black than white people voting for Trump because he's white. I think that both are stupid logics. That's not to say that, and the problem with blacks being the most loyal Democratic bloc is that it's always that the lesser than two evils logic, right? So it's certainly not that they should have voted for, I don't even know, whoever ran against Obama. What's the Mormon guy's name?
McCain?
No, Romney, right? So it's not that they should have voted otherwise, but there was so many people who voted for Obama because he was black, and I don't know that that's any, or I wonder why that's acceptable in ways that then we expect white people not to vote for Trump because he's advocating whiteness
but
in a particular way.
The point is that left politics is not mounting an alternative.
Right.
Left politics leaves.
I want to disagree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We love disagreement.
Ooh,
but
beef.
I want to just play it out. So the first thing I want to suggest is to at least think that think of neoliberalism as unfolding over the past 30 years.
40.
Okay, 40, fine. That we've had actually the left version of it with DIY, urban gardens, small is beautiful, self-care, anti-bigness, anti-welfare state, anti-anything that has to do with the state, all sorts of, right to the city, municipalism, globalization from below. So first pass is say, I would say it's not the case that the left has not had a response to neoliberalism. One, there has been a left that had its own neoliberalism.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's my point.
So
right.
Make that one. Okay, so that would be point one. Second one, there's also been a left that has tried to let's say hold on to some of the achievements of the welfare state, and that's just generally been just lost. So it's not that it hasn't had an alternative; it's that it's had one that's just repeatedly lost. But I think it's important not to lose that as to say it wasn't there at all, because then we don't see the last 40 years as a kind of terrain of struggle where folks are really trying to have been fighting it. And then let's say, well, I don't know, that there's several. Let's see, there's 3 people. I don't know who they are, but there are 3 people who've got really great ideas somewhere out there. But the problem is they don't have political power, authority, the apparatus. So this third problem would be, it's not the fact that the left doesn't have any ideas or a plan to confront neoliberalism. The problem's been capacity. And the capacity problem, or I want to now claim, is the biggest problem. That it's really been lack of, and I think the reason it has a lack of capacity is in part a lack of political will. And I think there's a lack of political will because too much of the left has embraced the small is beautiful, DIY, fragmented left neoliberalism. So if we there's a kind of dialectical unity of point 1 and point 3. But I want to maybe think about, rather than saying the left has no ideas, to think about what has happened with the left ability to build political capacity and to try to formulate a kind of common political will.
Yes.
I just want to add one constraint to that, which is it's not a case of two sides engaging on a political level, but once capital controls have been lifted in 1973, a whole other factor comes into play to this other political side that helps to have huge political effects that disorganize the left in and of itself. So one has to put that in as what made it especially hard to respond. You're not just responding to acts of a political party as such, but a whole change in the economic universe.
Yeah, sure, but I mean, if we look at the middle of the 19th century, capitalism was disorganized in a lot of ways, and a left still emerged. So I don't think that we can just.
I'm just adding that as part of the environment.
Yeah, but I think so. One, I would like to offer that there are lefts, like multiple left. So I don't think we can even. Like I said yesterday, I don't really know what the left means in the United States. I think it's abhorrent that there's neoliberals who are considered to be on the left. Like, so I guess I don't understand what that means, right? So, or we can say there's like an identitarian left, like an anti-capitalist left, like, so there are multiple lefts, which also I think undermines or places constraints on mass, kind of the consensus necessary to engage in sort of, to enter the state apparatus, right? The other thing that, I forgot the second thing I was going to say, but repression. I think that the other response, the reason why the left is so fragmented is because of the need for decentralization to evade and to navigate COINTELPRO, right? The massive sort of legislative architecture that shifted from anti-communism to the security. So the anti-communist architecture was then applied to sort of urban uprising and black nationalist insurgency, which then was sort of, morphed into kind of the law and order state and the ascendance of the sort of prison industrial complex, not just against blacks, but against radicals and dissidents, which then morphs into the war on terror. So the architecture set in place by anti-communism is still there, but the logics are still inhered in what has now become anti-terrorism. So that never went away. And so I think that the fragmentation and decentralization is a response to that, to the massive repression.
Yeah, I think empirically you're right. But if we also think about the conditions in Russia, let's just say between 1905 and 1817, a totally repressive state apparatus. If we look at the conditions in South Africa, in the struggle against apartheid, again, totally repressive apparatus, and yet in these places we see revolutionary movements and capacities to pull together. So I sometimes worry if, even as it's clearly the case that the repression in the 60s decimated left leadership in the U.S., it's also interesting to figure out how come that wasn't the case in other places. Like, why particularly here do we say that the repressive state is enough of an example, is enough of a explanation for decline, when in other places it's not?
Well, I think that I see your hand, and I just want to say one more thing. I think that well, you know what? Whatever. Okay, go ahead.
No.
Please.
I want to hear you say.
I was just going to say, the other thing about anti-apartheid is that virtually from its inception, it's a global movement, right? From like the 1930s, there's all of this stuff in black periodicals, from the Chicago Defender to Freedom magazine, Paul Robeson's magazine, that's anti-apartheid. You have the Council on African Affairs that, is foundation, is always anti-apartheid, right? So I always think that there's something about like global momentum that sustains sort of movements against repression, and we don't have that global. First of all, there's not a systematic push against any one thing, as people are doing all sorts of shit, right? And then there's no global.
You mean now, right now?
In this historical moment, which allows oppression to operate, and even in the 1970s, right? So this is part of.
But there's global struggle in the 1970s that would fit your latter point regarding the apartheid.
Right, but I think that in the 1970s things become increasingly fragmented. So to me, I would say the last sort of global push is anti-apartheid on the one hand. So there's student movements, black groups, et cetera, and also, I guess, among black people, specifically like the wars of liberation in like Angola and Mozambique. I think that after that moment, it's increasingly, I'm not certain. So Rwanda, let's take Rwanda, right? There was no mass response to genocide like in Rwanda when that occurred, right? And to me, that's reflective of either the reconfiguration of politics or the retreat of politics. I'm not certain what happened, but I do think that there is sort of a rupture or a reconstitution of politics in a way that looks still fundamentally different than the 1950s or the 1960s, or even the unique sort of character of anti-apartheid. I don't know. I was born in 1987, so this is my political milieu. So I have no idea. But I think that that's, you raise interesting points. Like, what is it about? It's not, repression isn't totalizing, right? So I don't know. Maybe we just got Apple, and then go ahead.
So we'll step back on black folks voting for Obama and white folks voting for Trump in that comparison.
Mm-hmm.
I was in Chicago as a middle school teacher, and the 99% African American school, and they were politically engaged in ways in Chicago because Obama was running. At the same time, on weekends, I was doing citizenship workshops, and we had lines out the door. We were extending hours. We were doing 8-hour workshops with hundreds of people that were registering to become citizens so they could vote and timing their citizenship. They lived in the country 20, 30 years, and they finally felt like they had a reason to vote.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if anyone has tracked those senses of like, okay, now is my chance to actually be represented. I see it in Seattle. I was involved in the beginning with Chama Sawant. The first time she ran, and they're like, I've never voted before. I've never volunteered for a political candidate. I've never gone to City Hall before. I've never been engaged on what's going on in my city before. But I finally feel like I have a reason. And so, I don't know. To me, it's really hard to hear that comparison of white Trump voters and then the people that are all of a sudden deciding to get involved because of these inspirational people that they feel reflect their voice or their history.
Yeah, I just would. I think that that's a good point, but I would just invite us to consider the persons who felt like Trump represented their condition and their history, and who voted for the first time for Trump, and who went out and campaigned for him. Because remember, Trump spent like $10 on his campaign. Mm-hmm. So it was people, right? It was, well, Koch brothers, or, it was capital, but also people who were funding this thing, right? And so again, if race or kind of abstract notions of possibility are what are galvanizing you, then to me, it's the content is different, obviously, but it's the similar types of logics, or the similar sort of apparatus to get people out. And so, I mean, I'm not saying that Obama is effectively Trump, or that people who voted for Obama were backward. What I'm saying is that, I don't know objectively if voting for somebody, the black president, because you're black, is qualitatively different than voting for the white supremacist because of whiteness. But maybe I also don't have a dog in the electoral politics thing. I'm a curmudgeon. My job in this world is just to hate everything. So maybe I'm wrong, Maybe I'm a Uncle Tom. Go ahead.
On this question of capacity is the main issue with your point. I'm not sure what that means, number one, and would like a more full explanation of what that means. And I think that the right is, even though there is intra-class struggle within the ruling class, there's competition and whatnot. The left is a mess compared to that. And in fact, it's not only a mess, but it's not even, it's barely anything. What is the left? What are the alternatives? There was Bernie Sanders, but there's basically the Democratic Party, which in my view is a waste. It's ultimately a liberal. It's their version of the neoliberal solution, and it's not going to get us anywhere. And I don't think anybody who is enchanted with the world in any respect is going to believe that the Democratic Party is going to get us anywhere.
Well, so don't do it too narrow. Think of the Socialist Party in France and all those center parties that have made themselves irrelevant. It's worldwide.
But if I may, on the question of the United States, and there are a number of parties that are third parties out there, but they don't seem to catch on, except the Democratic DSA may be growing faster than anybody else, but are they really going to come up with a solution that's not already fitting in with the Democratic approach or the neoliberal? So I'd like to hear what you have to say more about this question of capacity and how that is going to, if we solve that problem, then we should move forward.
Do you want to say something before?
No, just to make that point, I'll let Jody go on. The socialists in the French election, it's just literally amazing that they went down to 9%. And what happens to those parties, like the Democratic, is, they have a death wish, or they don't represent anybody.
Right.
And you look at the Democrats after Sanders and you think, all right, there were enough people in the party that wanted to kick out the Democratic Leadership Council neoliberal type, so they put Keith Ellison to run for it. And then Obama intervened and said, elect this guy.
Right, exactly.
And they kept it the same. And at which point Doug Henn would post, these guys have a death wish on Facebook, and you got to feel that way. So all these parties that have abandoned their base are just heading down from 9% to 8 to 0. What's coming in their place? I don't know.
Wait, hold on. So I think Fim, you wanted to add on to this interrogation.
I just wonder what the point of any of the other conversations are before we have the capacity, before we figure out the capacity issue. I'm sure there's a lot of backwards left ideology, but like if you showed me a basketball game and said this side gets to have all 5 people, this side gets 2 people, we could talk about what strategy the 2 people are going to use or how they're going to have teamwork and what they should believe about themselves, but it really doesn't matter. The outcome is fixed by the starting material conditions of the contest.
Yeah, unless the 2 are like LeBron and Kobe, and the 5 are like whomever else.
From the LeBron of socialism,
anyway.
But the capacity that we're dealing with in the 21st century, with the capacity for violent force that military regimes have now, is not precedented in human history. You were a czar in 1912. Like your power was you could convince a few hundred people with pointy things to
I think
stab.
there was more than bayonets.
Right now we have cruise missiles and predator drones, and we don't even have what there was a few decades ago, which were nation states with amounts of money and war material on the scale of nation states willing to send that to Angola or Mozambique or etc. And so in the absence of that, we can critique ourselves all we want, and ideologically we should, but I don't see what, cleaning house and that, like, what mileage that would make up, if we haven't solved the capacity question.
Somebody go.
This kind of reminds me to the immediate problems where we have with Amazon and the tax for homeless people, and and it's in those struggles that we learn how to organize ourselves, and those opportunities keep coming up over and over again, and it's just a way of how we connect it and how new layers of people are learning how to struggle, such as teachers in the South fighting and them connecting up, and where and that comes into play with just the basics of solidarity, and then whichever group is most organized is the one that can at least learn the lessons and point forward, and that's what the left has to do at this point right now. It's at this point is building ourselves and learning how to move forward and push things forward, and know that there's going to be waves, and you go forward, you go back, but having an organization that's got its ear to the ground and to be able to respond to those changes that prompt people to move forward. And right now the Amazon tax thing is getting people to talk, but they haven't, a lot of those people haven't moved at the rate like, say, Parkland students push themselves. So it's kind of like we're in this building phase, and we have all these opportunities that are popping up everywhere, every place, and we have to relearn how to struggle and how to take political theory and move it forward. What does solidarity mean? How do you prevent yourself from becoming ultra left and saying, ultra left and anyway, I'm not sure about the ultra left. I haven't figured out how to relate it to the struggles. What do those struggles mean if we can't move forward? It's a learning process.
I think that was a wonderful statement.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree very much about the building. And that's actually something that I was thinking about when I mentioned capacity. It's building together, not just going into a destructive mode or a critical mode or a co-opted Democratic Party mode, but actually building in terms of the struggles and combining them and having a new capacity for collective action. So that strikes me as the primary problem on the left. Like, not to make, I'm not saying that I'm not saying this as an anti-electoral politics position. I think it's exciting when socialists are able to get candidates, but I think that the preoccupation with electoral politics under the conditions we have, a two-party, ultra-wealthy, the two factions of the 1%. That's what electoral politics is at the national level. And that to be preoccupied with that, clearly, there's no left there. There's no left within miles of that. So the left has to build capacity in a different way under these circumstances.
But it still needs a party.
I'm in favor of a party. Yeah.
I would say it feels to me like there's no like the idea is missing, right? Like what there's no central, like there is. You said earlier like the surveillance state is not a totality, but I would argue value is. Like value is a social totality, and we have no way to like think of solutions that don't continue to reproduce those forms. Like we don't know what those are, and I think since that's why you simultaneously see the collapse of like leftist parties in general. Like although the Soviet Union was clearly not the savior, at least having like an alternative opened up space for imagination. And now with like seemingly no other alternative, there's no imagination, and there's not like that idea of the event that allows people to kind of galvanize and unfold towards something that's different and new. At least that's what it feels like to me.
I don't understand why something has to be new. One, two, why? Like I don't.
New
that the Soviet Union doesn't exist doesn't mean that communism is not still the primary horizon for the left, right? I mean that people haven't coalesced around it. That's part of the struggle, right? It's not giving up.
Right.
Instead we need something new.
And I think it takes the capacity. Like I think that's actually part and parcel of the capacity problem, is because that has to be sort of a social idea, and without like the capacity and the ability to navigate that through all the individual struggles, like there's that galvanizing sort of idea that's emerged about how we do this. It's coming.
That's the fight.
I think you have to have, I think the thing to do is to have faith that it will come and to work in good faith.
Revolutionaries are always optimistic. That's what Fidel Castro says. Go ahead, Guy. And then, or I don't know. Pronouns. Oh, sorry. However you self-identify. Go ahead.
So based on the, like you were talking about, like if you're looking towards history and then sort of everything, it just gives you a bunch of tools, and you're based on those bunch of tools, that sort of forms a bunch of solutions, right? But so keeping that in mind, and also the conversation about, okay, what is the left, in the U.S., if it exists or not, so is a kind of a question. But like the question of what are we even, like what is the left even supposed to do, right? Like, is it to get universal healthcare, or like those questions fundamentally maybe not everyone agrees with, right? Or at least it depends on which is more important, what is the primary contradiction, or what is it. So, but I'm just thinking, to me it seems that any chance of any fundamental change in the US, it cannot come when US is still the leader of the empire. Like, I don't see how that is even, like, I don't even know what that would look like, or at least would manifest in, we can get universal healthcare while, yes, other countries are being bombed, but we don't care about it because it doesn't show up on TV.
Yeah, that's like the quote, the James Boggs quote, right, that Scott offered yesterday, that if socialism happens in the United States, it'll be like basically a very sort of anemic form, because of the ways in which the United States is the heart of empire, and socialism only here is obviously built on the backs of the exploitation elsewhere. So Samir Amin, Du Bois made this argument in like 1915. So you gotta go. She had her hand up. She's had her head up for a long time.
Well,
after you're done, please finish.
So now to build up, like, say, anti-imperialist, like some kind of solidarity, I feel the problem is to now relate to someone outside of the sphere or this iron bubble that the English media or whatever the US is in requires, like, you have to touch base with history, right? If I have to say, oh, I actually support some other traditional enemy of the US or something like that, like the justification or like they are still tied into history. So it's hard to say, oh, we are totally new. And I think the problem is when people say they want to like detach from history and look toward the future, they also sort of divorce themselves from any reality because a lot of other people are still in, you know, what would be considered history. So like, I don't know, I think like history, anchoring yourself in history, I think is sort of necessary because that's how many of you relate to people outside the, you know, the, like whatever this bubble that people are in, right? So, like I feel many times having those hammers is good because that's what everyone else, like that's how you build coalitions outside the US. I feel the desire to always look at something new actually hampers that. You know, it just becomes, oh, nobody else has any idea what the hell is happening in the US because they're not talking in any way that everyone else can understand, or it has no relevance really. So.
Yeah, I don't think that having a more robust toolkit necessitates an abdication of history. It's a more kind of thorough and sort of careful mining of history. I'll keep it short. Go ahead.
Well, something I'm just thinking of a lot in terms of like the focus on the left here, and kind of back to your question, it was about why would a population vote against its own best interest? And I think like I struggle with the idea that the right is stupid and that the far right especially is not really organized. They do a lot of work. I actually think they're really organized, really brilliant on the ground based building work, especially with the populations that are voting against their own interests, which is not necessarily a name of like the right or like the Republican Party, but it's in terms of like some other form of collective organizing that actually is, you know, particularly for the Pacific Northwest, very strong. I mean, it's and there are. I just wonder about the role of that and like the left of the left, you know, looking at that kind of thing in relationship to that, as that's like an important dimension of it in terms of this voting against your own interest thing, which is coming from not necessarily thinking about the state in terms of how the far right's thinking. They're looking to control the state, but not necessarily to like organizing itself is working with like those base populations really directly in terms of the rural spaces. So I'm wondering how that relates to some of this other organizing and some of this other desire, or how it can open that up and turn back around. Because when you were talking about that, that was the first, I thought of the right first.
Yeah.
Far right, not just right.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that it's worth reiterating that the right has history on their side. It has the structures on their side. We as the left are swimming upstream, right? That's the fundamental difference, I think, in terms of effectivity, is that we're like spitting into the wind and they have like wind in their sails, I think. Hold on, this guy had I just want to include the voices that haven't been included.
Yeah, so just continuing about the operation and the alternative question, I was thinking about maybe what we missed is the family and how capital has targeted the youth, especially the students. Like if you want to make a comparison, even between 90s to now, it is crazy, you know, because the public space is gone, everything is, you know, everybody's entrepreneur to some degree. So the students, because the mass movements usually happen when there's a number of students or young people who don't have time to think about theory and just take action following some other people, you know. They happen in the 60s a lot of times. So even now in Mexico, for example, because of the university system is kind of, you know, it doesn't cost thousands of dollars to go to university. Students have the capacity to mobilize and do this type of work. But now with the debt system and the prison industrial complex and everything else, I think that's, I mean, when I look at the universities, it's completely hopeless in the US. I mean, the small number of people who are organizing or who are interested in politics either are into this like withdrawal mode of going somewhere else and kind of this anarchistic ways of finding something extra somewhere else, or just completely don't care about what's happening. Okay. So, yeah, I think that's something.
That's a good point. Okay, Jody, resolve this all for us, please.
No,
Give us all the solutions.
I'm not going to resolve anything. But I do want to push back against the right has history on their side, or the right has the wind in their sails. I don't think that's correct. I think it's much more that we're in a much more chaotic situation. You can call it civil war than we are a situation where everything is it's sort of like smooth sailing for them. I mean, from a right-wing standpoint, the fact that there are women who can sort of have some degree of control over our lives is considered utterly threatening. From the right-wing standpoint, the fact of that gay marriage is recognized and not even a thing is for them understood as a defeat. But they look at a lot of the cultural victories of the last 20 or 30 years as huge attacks on them. So I think that I'm trying to be precise and not say that's the measure of left politics. All I want to do is say that we can use that as a measure of the right not necessarily having the tendencies going in their direction. So I think it's a more complex and messed up situation of civil war than that.
Yeah, so I just really quickly, I just think when I say that the right has a state, I think the right has a state on its side insofar as the historical and endemic aversion to the left and to popular uprising, like that is manifested in, for instance, like the ways in which activists, especially racialized activists, are killed with virtual impunity, and the recent passing of legislation criminalizing sort of activism. So I think that there has been breaches temporarily, but I think that is part of the state apparatus to repression, right? So
I think that the fact that the right has had to seize the control of the state directly is a sign of weakness. It means that they are not sure that they can guarantee capital accumulation in the future. They don't know that it's going to last, whether it's from climate, whether it's from people who stop fracking and so forth, and they want to extract as much as possible now, which is why you look at the people that Trump has in his camp, they don't even bother to present some notion of public interest in any way at all. They're just privatizing as much land as they can and doing this, So I think that doesn't make it less dangerous for us on the left. It just means that they feel pretty insecure too. Maybe
but I think that sort of myopia, I think that makes it doubly dangerous because on the one hand, history is on their side, and on the other hand, the fact that they don't recognize it, so they double down, is like a double threat because it's like they already. I mean, I don't know. So maybe I'm just pessimistic. I don't know.
But I just wonder if it's not the opposite of both of these points, right? So maybe it's desperation and they're trying to get security in anticipation of later crisis, or maybe it's just opportunity and they think they could get more security and more stuff, which is just capitalists being capitalists, right? If Amazon can get people to pay taxes to them rather than the government, they're going to do it because it's just more stuff for them. And even the cultural losses of maybe the religious right, to me, can be explained by contradictions internal to the right. So, what occurs to me in that case is not the right as a whole losing to the neoliberal center or the left, but it seems like the religious, socially conservative right losing to the libertarian right, which is happy to make the concession of letting people get married in exchange for tax policies that give them what they think is more interesting. So if we have if that's the fracture of the right that's at issue, then both of these things seem like things that show the right as ascendant, maybe even newly ascendant, and puts history on their side.
Well, that's a good question to ask. Is capital accumulation harder now than it was before the financial crisis? And
you can do it all about it tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly.
farther digging.
True.
That's a good way to end.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.